So we are going to start off this afternoon with two papers for the distributional effects of generative AI. And we're going to start, and we're going to start with Felipe Balcazar from Yale, who is going to present distributive conflict in the age of AI.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Very nice to have you here for this 2% work in progress with Michael Becher and Daniel Estegmulla on the distributive conflict in the age of AI. So just to motivate this talk here, we have a very famous graph by Carl Frey in which he essentially shows the density of work in the y-axis, and in the x-axis he shows the probability of computerization, and he shows that essentially there is a big chunk of jobs that are at high risk of automation. And something that we have been discussing today and that has been discussed at the news is, for example, that potentially the advent of AI could threaten the work of tech workers, of creatives, and other people using essentially information and communication technologies. As an example of this, a few years ago, we have here in LA a big strike by performers and writers alike, in which 160,000 of them were very concerned about the plans that were taking place with AI that could potentially threaten their jobs. Another thing that we also see during this time around is that if we look at Google Trends scores, which is essentially how much interest is in a given topic, we see that here in the y-axis we have the month year, and there was actually not much of searches related to will AI take over my job, but suddenly they spike as soon as the release of ChatGPT. And here in this red shaded area is essentially the time where these AI strikes took place. And also with this potentially increased concern by people on AI, also we observe that there is an increase in the likelihood that they are asking Google, how can I join my union, how can I join my training union, and so on and so forth. So it seems that something is going on there. So having this motivation in mind, the question we're trying to answer with this paper is, does AI increase distributive conflict and collective action? So in a nutshell, something that we have been observing from a lot of the recent papers on this topic is that there has not been a lot of backlash against machines in and of itself, so there's no ludism taking place. But it seems that there is a decrease in other regarding attitudes, and particularly because AI could generate that sense of economic insecurity, and this could explain why some people might be adopting group attitudes. Also, here I'm going to show that it seems that AI could lead to increased collective action, particularly conflicts between the worker and the firm in the form of collective bargaining agreements. And this is pretty much very consistent with work that I have done in this regard, for example, using robot adoption also as a form of automation. However, here, a little bit different thing that I'm going to do is that I'm going to be focusing on that the effect of AI on workers is driven particularly by having high de-skilling risk, and so I'm going to show a non-monotonic effect on the distribution of skills. So despite I took quite some time trying to find good case studies and data to do this, I'm going to focus in the US because it's really the data that works best for studying this. And so here, again, we have the Google Trends score, and here we have the date. And this shaded area here is where ChatGPT was announced. And as we can see here, we see a spike in people's interest in searching terms related to ChatGPT during this time period. And then later on, we see it here as well on GPT-4. But here, the narrative changes to more AI. And I'm not going to use this as an event, particularly because I have found evidence of potential anticipation there. So it doesn't really lend itself to very clean statistical analysis. So in this regard, during this time frame here, we observed that searches on ChatGPT were the sixth rising term in the US, or like the term with the sixth most growth in terms of searches. It was in the 5th percentile of rankings for millions of searches during this time period. And per my calculations, this uptick that we see here is about 10 million people essentially searching for this type of term. We also observed that there is geographical variation across the US, and this is measured with media market level data. And so here we observe that, as we would expect, there is a lot of interest here in the West Coast, here in the East Coast as well, and as well a little bit here around the area of Austin in Texas. So there's a lot of geographical variation. So in order to start understanding what ChatGPT can mean for the behavior of workers in particular, I'm going to posit the following theory. So I'm going to divide workers in 3 types. So we have unskilled workers, so for example, workers that have high school education or less, medium skilled workers, which are essentially workers that have technical degrees or of just bachelor degrees, and then highly skilled workers, which have graduate degrees like most of the people, if not everybody in this room. So also I'm going to make a distinction between adoption, which is like, for example, when we have a very well-developed market for a technology, like for example for robots, that is what we have studied mostly before. But now here we're going to focus on innovation, which is this new technological change that can lead to this skilling. So in this regard, if we think about adoption, we know that from a lot of the literature that the unskilled might be substituted by robots. The medium skilled, some of them might be substituted by robots if, for example, their tasks can be easily automated by a machine. And the highly skilled are potentially complements because they become more productive per hour work, as like, for example, these type of machines are being introduced into the workplace. With an innovation like GPT, things are a little bit different. It's unclear necessarily if unskilled workers are going to be substitutes because, for example, workers using this type of AI technologies, now they can probably perform tasks that they couldn't perform before, so they can become more productive, so some of them might not be substituted. Middle skilled workers, because they are increasingly using ICTs, and they perform more basic and automatable tasks, they're more likely to be replaced, substituted by, for example, things like ChatGPT. And highly skilled labor, also, like some of them might be substituted, but for example, this highly skilled labor has a very high level of tasks that necessitate creativity and critical thinking, which are tasks that ChatGPT cannot perform very well, for instance, but they can become more productive using them to perform, like, for example, research activities and so on and so forth. So in this case, I'm going to focus on this concept of the skilling, which is essentially that, particularly for the middle skilled workers, their marginal productivity of labor vis-a-vis machines is going to decline because of this technological innovation. And so what this is going to imply, essentially, is because, for instance, particularly for the middle skill, because they are they're facing potentially lower wages or higher unemployment, lower employment prospects. So that is going to create a sense of scarcity or economic vulnerability, and that might lead them to adopt in-group attitudes, and so essentially to show lower support for other regarding attitudes. Likewise, when it comes to more distributive conflict between the firm and the worker, what we would observe is that, for example, if these workers have that threat, so the marginal return to their effort is declining, and that means that, relatively speaking, the marginal return to rent seeking is going up, and so they are more likely to end up, for example, engaging in collective action, like, for example, unionizing or engaging in collective bargaining agreements. So having this in mind, just to summarize, so the advent of ChatGPT should reduce other regarding attitudes, should increase firm versus workers' distributive conflict, and this should happen especially for workers in the middle of the distribution of skills. So my empirical strategy is essentially a difference in event discontinuity. So I'm using, again, the advent of ChatGPT as an event, and I'm using the information that I have for 2022, and also the survey data for 2020 in order to capture any potential things related to seasonality of actions or opinions by people. And so my dependent variable is going to be essentially voters' opinions that is being gleaned from the CCS, collective bargaining data from the NLRB. My main independent variable is going to be ChatGPT measured as the intensity by the Google Trends. My moderator here, because I'm interested precisely in this heterogeneous effect, is going to be education, but I'm working on creating a much more rich measure using existing measures of RTI on generative AI. And I include a battery of controls, including characteristics of the individual, a time polynomial before and after, fixed effects by DMA, fixed effects by industry, and survey round fixed effects. I also use Conley standard errors and Bonferroni corrections just to do proper inference. And essentially, this is what I'm going to be focusing on is on the total effect here. So just to show you a little bit of evidence that this design kind of could be potentially credible. So first, I compute optimal bandwidths around the event. I have that this is more or less a 2-day optimal bandwidth with about 3,000 to 4,000 observations. We observe no evidence of manipulation. We also observe evidence of balance. Also, we observe some sort of preliminary evidence for absence of pretreatment trends. So particularly if we focus right here, T-2, this is the 2 days, I'm like pulling together the 2 days before the announcement of ChatGPT, and we don't observe like potential anticipation, but we do observe here in the 2 days after the release some sort of effect. So also to provide a little bit more credibility for this, so I did an analysis of the effective regression weights just to be sure that no one place was driving these results. And overall, the Gini is pretty low for this. It's 17, whereas for most other observational studies, it tends to be like above 60, that Gini. And so this gives me a lot of confidence that there's not a lot to worry here. The only thing is probably here that we have that, again, in Austin, Texas, there is a lot of, the effect is, it's pretty strong there. So although right now I don't have yet data to test this mechanism, let me show you here that we might believe that essentially the advent of ChatGPT could create these feelings of uncertainty, given that this is, in the y-axis, we have the private sector layoffs in thousands, and here we have an uptick around the release of ChatGPT, and this is related to basically the big tech companies laying off thousands of workers, and part of the reason why they were laying thousands of workers was precisely due to the advent of AI. And going forward, I'm going to extend a little bit the Acemoglu, Restrepo, and author analysis in this regard to try to provide more evidence on this end. But jumping into the more political effects, so here in the y-axis, we see the effect of the release of ChatGPT. This is measuring standard deviations, which is essentially a 2.4 million searches. Okay, and so we observe that if we look at indexes that are trying to capture opinions on different things, we see that the index on racial attitudes seems to be the one in which we observe that middle-skilled workers are reducing they're showcasing a lower racial attitudes index. What does this mean? Essentially, what it means is that they're less likely to support ideas of equal opportunity and affirmative action. So also, just to a sanity check that I do on this, I try to see what is driving this effect, and I see that, for example, only for those that use social media, there seems to be a statistically significant effect. Those that use social media in the 24 hours preceding their interview. And this is kind of interesting because like the ChatGPT was not covered like broadly by the news until the release of ChatGPT 4. And so actually I did check what would happen with other sources of information, and this is the only one that popped up, which makes a lot of sense because this news, as far as I understand, was being transmitted to the social media. So when we look now at the components of the index of racial attitudes, we observe that across the line, there seems to be an effect very similar to the one I showed you before for the aggregated index. I don't want to make yet interpretations about the size of this index because it's still work in progress, so I still want to make sure that everything is very precise in order to make such claims. When it comes to the effect on firms versus workers, so here what we observe is that in the x-axis, we have an index of teleworkability. So here we're expecting a more linear relationship instead of the non-monotonic one I mentioned before. And something that we observe is that for those places, for particularly those firms where workers a high level of risk of being replaced by AI, we see particularly higher higher number of people in collective bargaining agreements. But unfortunately, we don't see necessarily on other outcomes. Likewise, and this happens across the board, and I'm hoping that as I am improving the measure of risk towards GPT, this might change a little bit, but overall what we observe as well is that after the release of ChatGPT, there seems to be a higher rate of termination of collective bargaining processes, and also more days engaged in collective bargaining. So what this is saying is like very similar to what happened in the 80s with the advent of robots. Essentially, workers are seeing the threat of potentially being replaced by AI, like ChatGPT, and what they're doing is that they're trying to act on it, to try to engage in collective bargaining to withstand the impact of this, but they're doing so at a lower level of bargaining power. And so to conclude, what we find here is that the effect of automation may depend on whether it's the skill or not. So that is like telling us like who might be affected. And here I'm focusing on innovation, the ChatGPT innovation, that seems to be more likely to threaten skilled labor, middle skilled labor. So something that we can conclude from this is that for college-educated workers with not graduate degree, ChatGPT seems to reduce their other regarding attitudes. Also, there seems to be some evidence that it increases firms versus workers disagreements, particularly captured by collective bargaining agreements. But like it seems that unions are going with lower bargaining power into these agreements. And going forward, as I mentioned before, we're putting a lot of work on trying to improve our measure of AI threat, because there are many measures of AI threat, but they measure very different things. So it's important to understand them well. So we're not there yet. And I also want to use a measure of demand for AI jobs, very similar to, again, like what Acemoglu, Restrepo, and Otter did to try to understand what is the impact on observable outcomes regarding unemployment. So that being said, that is all I have. Thank you so much. Should I put it here?
All right, great. Do we have any questions? Do you want, maybe I can.
Hello? Okay. I just have a comment, and I'd like your reaction on it. If I were to speak to some of these workers, I would say, you're really getting ahead of yourself, because if you think of this as a 9-inning game, we're like in the bottom of the first inning, and if you look at industrial revolutions in the past, it's taken decades for the commercialization potential and diffusion of technologies to really matriculate in the economy and really affect the features of the labor market in terms of skill sets. And I would say an analog here could be like electrification, which took 70 years plus, really. If you think about the impact it had on productivity and substitution effects for labor, or if you think of the internet, it would be akin to saying something like, well, back in 1999, Cisco's stock was like skyrocketing, and people thought that Netscape Navigator was going to be huge, but it turns out that the actual platforms that created the network effects were much more valuable than something like Navigator, which has network effects, but commercially, the browser market just wasn't where it was at. So I'm just wondering if, and you're just finding facts, so I'm not impugning the facts, but I'm just wondering if we're just too ignorant about what things are going to look like in terms of the ultimate expression of the commercialization of the technologies. And the final thought would be ChatGPT is like that Netscape Navigator, it seems. It's kind of become a commodity. If you look at all its competitors, they all charge $20 and do about the same stuff. Their costs are extremely high and their margins are very low because of all the energy consumption and the fact that they pay all this money to like NVIDIA to buy the chips or the cloud computing to actually run the models. So I just wonder what your thoughts are on where we are now and what the future might look like for labor dynamics if you think about these examples.
You take a couple? Okay, yeah, great.
Hi, great work and great paper. I had so I really like the idea of ChatGPT shock, and I see a parallelism with the China shock, and so that it will be able, or that now it will be easier to identify the effects of technology, just because in the past maybe it was more gradual, and here we have something like that's more shock-wise. But I agree with the point that maybe it's a bit too early to detect some of the effects, and that's a great design, but that will maybe require some years of checking at what happens. And just to bring, we did couple of surveys in Catalonia to both firms and workers. And firms, only 2 or 3% said that they are adopting actively the technology and changing processes. But many, many workers are using it, and that now we are in a moment of workers cheating at firms in a way. And I think it will take time for managers to figure out how really to adapt and so on. And that, maybe you are just looking at a very short-term effect, and you'll be able to see others. Yeah.
Can I take one more, Felipe, and then you can respond? Does that sound good?
I'm sorry?
I was just going to give you one more question, maybe we'll respond.
Sure.
Okay.
Thanks for this, Felipe. I agree this would be a really valuable shock to examine in the future and to have a good feel for. I think my thinking also matches that there's a sort of a few layers of uncertainty that we're facing here, including whether we're talking about workers' subjective sense of risk or objective risk. So we have some findings that people think other people are at risk, but that they're not at risk. And I think your mechanism involves something like awareness, driving a sense of precarity, driving these kinds of actions. But I don't think we have settled yet. Are we going to see differentiation to exposure, substitution, or complementarity along skill levels? Does it look different? Does it vary along tasks now? Are there other types of dimensions? So even some of the assumptions about creative work or cognitive work, I think we want to settle how some of that plays objectively before we sort of can be really confident in how some of these shocks would play out. So I think one good starting place would be looking at measuring awareness and how that actually changes workers' perceptions of risk, and then from there seeing how that changes their behavior. There may be more sort of direct observational or survey or interview work or things like that to get a feel for the story.
Do you want to take a go and respond?
Yeah. Thanks so much for the question. So if I take them together as a whole, essentially is maybe what I'm capturing here is jumping too far ahead insofar as we are still seeing how the labor market equilibrium adjusts to AI and ChatGPT and all these new tools. I completely agree with that is something we don't have an answer to yet. And actually, after reading a lot of work on this regard, I honestly don't think we do. However, something that this was trying to understand a little bit better is to try to understand what are the implications, what are the observable implications of being subject to the prospect that these might happen. So I agree that people were faced with this information, and probably they have their senses of certainty, and they're interpreting the information in a certain way. That is essentially what I was trying to capture here in a way that kind of made sense from the point of view of changes in the marginal productivity of labor. That is essentially what I was trying to do there. But I definitely believe that this is just a snapshot of that one period in time that allows us to understand how do workers react to the uncertainty and the risk and the economic insecurity that can be created by the fact that suddenly this technology became available and became a big, there was a big fuss about it. Looking towards the future in terms of how we can understand this and how we're studying this, I think that something that we're still not quite sure about is the degree to which, for example, these technologies might complement or substitute certain types of labor in certain occupations. Like I can say that, at least once again mentioning the Asamoglu, Restrepo, and author paper, they don't find much of an effect on anything, and precisely is because there has been so little time for the market to adapt to it. But at least I think that these, what I'm presenting here, give us at least a starting point on how to think about this going forward. I would say that I would keep it at that without trying to say that this is what's going to happen. I think that this just gives us like a template to think about it. Yeah.
Great, thanks.